Hello everyone. So in this video, I will be looking at Ragefest 5's voting results and giving my personal opinions on them. To start, I just want to say that these are just my personal opinions. I have my disagreements with the voting results, but I am by no means trying to negate them. Though, keep in mind that in future contests, should there be any, I'm probably going to have a different system for determining the winners of each award. Some of these results straight up don't make any logical sense, such as Tale of Part 2 getting second place in the Ring Award. I'll get into that later. Just know that in the future I'm going to have a different system, because I want the results to more accurately represent what submissions deserve. And with that out of the way, let's begin. Let's start with the Strategist Award, which is given to the submission that is the most challenging but also fair. That last part is important because it means that people have to apply creativity and effort in order to make a challenging submission. Otherwise, you could just put in a whole bunch of traps or flood the screen with enemies and call it a day. We're not trying to be Mega Man X6 here, guys. For this award, Tactical Nonsense got the most votes. I don't agree with this. I agree that Tactical Nonsense's gameplay is pretty good, but it doesn't reach the heights of the best. Let's start with what it does well. For one, whenever the submission isn't being retardedly rigid, it's pretty open-ended and you're allowed to train your units and get items any way you like, which gives this game some replayability alongside with the secrets and the different endings. Another thing Tactical Nonsense has going for it is that it's hard as fucking shit, at least in Chapter 1. And you can tell that Dat Boy Matthew put a lot of thought in the first chapter, because anytime I've seen people try to get around the difficulty, Dat Boy Matthew always had something in store for it. For example, I watched Pontagonist try to beat the submission in a different way from me, and the sequence break he did required several turns of trial and error and effort. Another thing that Tactical Nonsense does well is that there's very little RNG, and thus very few opportunities to get fucked by it. When you lose, you have very little to blame outside of your own mistakes, because the RNG rarely comes into play. Now let's talk about what Tactical Nonsense doesn't do well. Number 1. Many situations in the chapters only have one way to beat them. I spent a lot of time in Ragefest 4 complaining about submissions that I considered one strat only, because it reduces the replay value of the submission. I also just don't find it fun when I have to guess the exact movements the author intended me to do, because then it's no longer my own personal experience, and sometimes it's not clear what I'm supposed to do until several turns later when it's too late. Though, to be fair, Tactical Nonsense doesn't really have that last issue. It's usually very clear what you did wrong, but there are some submissions that are one strat only that have this issue, and it really fucking sucks. Another issue with Tactical Nonsense is, well, Chapter 2. Once you rescue Vesper, there's really not much else to do except to bait out the enemies and grind. If you're trying to steal the item that the boss is holding, you have to specifically train up Vandal Swiftblade. If you didn't train him much before getting Vesper, then there are enough enemies for you to get him up to snuff to steal that item, but it's just busy work. Lastly, we've got Chapter 3, which I feel is drawn out for a bit too long. There are moments where all you're doing is just moving your units to the next location, or just bait and switching enemies, and the map doesn't have enough unique challenges to justify its length. Though, if you're taking the path on the right, that's a pretty minor complaint because the right side has more stuff going on. It's if you go on the left side where those complaints become kind of a big deal. Overall, though, I feel the strengths outweigh the weaknesses of Tactical Nonsense. And it makes sense that it got the Strategist Award because it was insanely difficult while also being fair. I feel I should redefine the Strategist Award ever so slightly to also include fun in that description. There are a good few moments in Tactical Nonsense that are extremely hard but not fun. And I don't want to encourage people to make submissions that are super difficult without actually being fun to play. Now let's move on to second place, which was Tale of Part 2. It perplexes me to think that somehow Tactical Nonsense managed to beat Tale of Part 2 in the Strategist Award, seeing as how Tale of Part 2 is a better designed game. Unlike Tactical Nonsense, none of the chapters are drawn out for longer than they need to be. And unlike Tactical Nonsense, where you could be spending one turn baiting out a single enemy just to progress, the turns in Tale of Part 2 are much more involved on average. You always have multiple units on your team, and every turn you will be using all of them. and every chapter keeps a consistent flow of challenges to keep you interested. One of the things in Tale of Part 2 that I found especially impressive is how it conveys to you where the bosses are in Chapter 2. Because it's a Fog of War map, there's only so far you can see, but Tale of Part 2 places 2 sheep people far outside of where you are and has the bosses attack them. When you see this happen, not only is it great for immersion purposes because it shows you how ruthless the enemy is, but it also tells you exactly where they are and when to expect them to reach you. In terms of game design, this is probably one of the most genius things I've ever seen in Ragefest. The one thing that Tale of Part 2's gameplay does that I really don't like is that it's even more rigid than tactical nonsense. There is very little room for deviation from the intended strategy of each chapter. There's also very little optional content, and the characters don't even level up. So once you've played Tale of Part 2 once, you never need to play it again, because your next playthrough isn't going to be different in any meaningful way. With all this said, neither of these submissions are the one I would choose for Strategist Award. That would be The Roots That Bind. When I think of my ideal Fire Emblem chapter, I think to myself, okay, I want it to be difficult, I want the enemies to be consistently flowing so that the player constantly has things to do, I want there to be a bunch of side objectives, and I want to have a whole bunch of options, and I don't want things to be too luck-based, but I also want there to be some RNG with a decent margin for error, so that I'm forced to improvise every now and then. The Roots That Bind fits all of this criteria, so in my eyes, this is the perfect chapter. Now, it is worth noting that I played version 1.3 on YouTube. That was not the version that I was given before the Ragefest deadline. That would be version 1.2. The difference between the two is that version 1.3 is more difficult. I don't know what version 1.2 was like, but from what I heard, the enemy stats are a little bit lower, which is actually good because one of the issues I had with version 1.3 was that sometimes the RNG was really bad. There were moments where I couldn't afford to miss something, and then it would just happen, and then my run would be ruined. Though that was mostly near the end of the chapter. It wasn't a frequent occurrence. So I guess The Roots That Bind isn't 100% perfect, but if I had played version 1.2, it probably would have been. The only other submissions that I think might be worthy of the Strategist Award would be Human Armory and Calm's Big Heist. But I feel both of those submissions have a few missteps in their design, and it's kind of hard to compete with perfection when you're not perfect. Calm's Big Heist had an anticlimactic Chapter 3, and that one situation in Human Armory where Erica gets teleported into a completely different area. While I understand that you can get her out of that situation on your first try, I still think it's kind of bullshit. I also didn't like that in order to stand a chance in the submission, you basically needed to get Inays on turn 3 or 4. And also the gimmick's a bit tedious. So there you have it. There's my thoughts on the Strategist Award. Next up is the Innovator Award. This is for the submissions that use a really unconventional idea or several unconventional ideas and implements them well. For me, there were only 3 contenders: Calm's Big Heist, Human Armory, and The Roots That Bind. All of these submissions are defined by their gimmick. Human Armory allows you to summon NPCs and warp them to anywhere you want on the map. Calm's Big Heist is about raising funds using the capture mechanic. And The Roots That Bind had the day and night cycle. Unfortunately, for most people, it seems that the day and night cycle was not innovative enough for their taste, and so only the Human Armory and Calm's Big Heist have notable results in this department. Though, to be fair, I could sort of see why. The day and night cycle in The Roots That Bind is mostly just a glorified reinforcement event. It's not only that, because once the day come, the night enemies disappear, but I could sort of see why people don't think that's enough to warrant Innovator. And additionally, The Roots That Bind's day and night cycle gimmick isn't quite as in-your-face as the gimmick from Human Armory or Calm's Big Heist. It's more of a complement to the gameplay rather than the focus. Now, even with all this defending, it's not even my pick for this award. That would be Calm's Big Heist. Not only do I feel the idea is more innovative than The Roots That Bind, but I also feel the idea has more longevity than the Human Armory's NPC teleportation gimmick. I can picture an entire hack being made with Calm's Big Heist's fundraising objective. Imagine for a second that each chapter you need to reach a specific threshold of gold in order to like feed your family. So each chapter you're hunting for different sources of gold, hoping to reach the thresholds before nighttime. Each chapter could have multiple optional objectives. Some king wants to pay you to kill some dude on the other side of the map. You stop a group of bandits from attacking some strangers and then they pay you some money. And of course the capture mechanic so that you can steal stuff and then sell it. I also feel that this is a great source of tension. Imagine for a second that you're just shy of meeting the threshold and you're on the last turn. So now you gotta figure out which one of your items you're willing to sell. And God knows which one is going to be more helpful down the line. Are you going to give up that 1-2 range magic sword, or are you going to give up that awesome tome that causes a status effect? The idea just sparks my imagination a lot more than human armory. Even if you used ASM to make the NPC teleportation gimmick less cumbersome, I just don't think there's much more you can do with the concept. And while I can see the fundraising objective being used in another hack, and the day and night cycle has already been used in a hack, The Last Promise, I just don't feel like the Human Armory's NPC teleportation gimmick has a place in a hack. It's just way too disconnected from the normal formula. Imagine that you're playing Fire Emblem normally, you're training up your units and stuff, and then suddenly the game launches on you a chapter where you barely use your units at all, instead use NPCs that fight for you. It's just too much of a 180 in gameplay. And so I'd say that my decision was ultimately decided by how useful the innovation is rather than the quality of it. Because in my opinion, all of them did their gimmicks very well, and it's hard to choose based on quality alone. Our third award is Artist. This is given to the submission whose artistic vision feels most realized. It uses audio and visuals in order to convey a strong atmosphere. In my opinion, this is totally uncontestable. Tale of Pert 2 clearly wins this one. The music choices during maps and cutscenes are very suitable. The animated cutscenes are a first for Ragefest. And the third chapter does a really fantastic job of getting you hyped for the final battle, with a beautiful song from Nair Automata playing in the background. I don't think Tale of Pert 2 is perfect in this regard. In particular, I think the portraits look a little MS Painty at times, and in Chapter 2 they just look straight up muddy. But when it comes to visual and audio design, I can't really think of a submission that comes anywhere close to it. Tactical Nonsense is really good at getting you immersed with its writing, but that doesn't apply to its visuals and audio, which feel a bit more uneven. For example, the player phase gives you some nice Toho music to listen to, but once it becomes enemy phase, it's usually some weird out-of-place music like Vampire Killer from Castlevania. Not only that, but the volume fluctuates a lot when different songs come on. Lastly, Tactical Nonsense only has one CG and no animated cutscenes, which I feel are the huge advantages that Tale of Pert 2 has over every other submission. Now, with this in mind, you might think that I'm placing Tactical Nonsense in second place. Actually, I'm not sure. There's one other submission that I feel has a rather strong atmosphere, and that would be Asylum of Irony. This submission does a really good job of making it feel like you're actually in a prison and you're trying to break out. It also does a really good job of making you feel like you're going fucking insane. The music in the submission really emphasizes this, especially Chapter 2's player phase theme, which makes you feel tense, uncertain, and like you're actually starting to lose control of your sanity. Though, thinking about it, a lot of the atmosphere of Asylum of Irony comes from what you're doing rather than the audio and visuals. And because I specifically defined the Artist Award based on those two things, maybe it doesn't make sense to give it second place. I feel the Artist Award needs to be renamed and redefined, perhaps to the Atmosphere Award instead. But that's a concern for another day. Next up is the Animator Award. This is for submissions that have really awesome battle animations. Though with Tale of Pert 2 having cutscene animations, perhaps I should broaden the definition a bit. That way cutscene animations are included as well. When it comes to this award, I usually only consider submissions that have custom animations exclusive to it. For example, Crusaders of the Void has a custom Eliwood with bow animation. Should this count? For me, no, because it's not a custom animation that was made specifically for the submission. It was made by somebody else who intended the animation be used by the community rather than a specific hack. Considering most submissions don't have exclusive custom animations, there's only a small handful of qualifiers here. And let's be real, even then it's clearly a Tale of Pert 2. And I say that even though a lot of the animations look really janky, especially Boevar's. I mean, shit, it doesn't even look like she really stabs the person so much as like she puts the sword in them and then they just get hurt. However, there are some really cool animations in the submission as well. For example, Tiny's. Seeing him turn into a big fucking ogre and chopping the enemy into tiny little pieces is really cool to watch when you see it the first time. Though I will point out that due to the length of the animation, it gets pretty old after you've seen it enough times. If you were to ask me what my favorite animation in Tale of Pert 2 is, it would be Dusk's animation. It's satisfying in the same way that the rogue animation in FE8 is satisfying. You see him charge towards you, but then he goes invisible, and then he pops up right in front of your face and just gives you a good fucking smack. The pause right before the claw comes down on the enemy really sells it, because it gives it a real sense of momentum and weight. But it wouldn't feel good if the claw didn't go super fast afterward, which it does. It's a simple animation, but I never get tired of it because it just feels so good every time it hits. The only other submission whose animation stood out to me, or rather, animation, was Purge of Ouija. Anybody who has watched or played Purge of Ouija remembers the gun animation that's shown at the very end of the submission. If you put the animation under scrutiny, it's nothing special from a technical standpoint, but it was used really well, and I think that deserves mention. But yeah, Tale of Pert 2, no contest, let's move on. Next up is the Portrait Award. This is for the submission with the highest quality portraits. In this case, I'm only counting portraits that are custom made, but if they're from other hacks, that's okay. For me, this is more about the average overall quality of the portraits rather than the few specific standouts. Most submissions that had custom portraits did a really good job of having decent portraits. Not spectacular, but decent. Presentable. I think the four that stand out to me as particularly good would be Ragefest Chronicles, The Roots That Bind, Tactical Nonsense, and Tale of Pert. Let's start with Ragefest Chronicles. Before I said that the portraits have to be completely custom, with Ragefest Chronicles that's contestable because a lot of the characters are splices from the original Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem games. Some of them look fully custom, like the Explorer dude, who may actually be fully custom, I can't tell. However, there's also ones such as the Witch Lady Final Boss, who just looks like Sonya from FE7, but palette swapped and with gadgets plastered onto her face. At the end of the day, though, I still think they're all different enough to count. And most of them look really good, which I didn't even think about until I actually sat down and thought about it. So with that in mind, I place it in fourth. Next up, we've got The Roots That Bind. Every portrait in this game looks absolutely fantastic. The only exception is myself, but since I'm supposed to look bad, it doesn't matter. I think the two most memorable portraits in this submission are Cow Cow and the cat dude. What I like about Cow Cow's portrait is that he looks so contemplative, so thoughtful. He really gives off the air of a strategic leader that you can put your trust in. It's especially funny when you see him walking into the village with Nino in it, and she's talking about always remembering a happy day, and he's just kind of over there in the corner just like, where the hell am I? As for the cat general dude, I'm pretty sure that one was made by Gast, because Gast is known for his furry characters in Fire Emblem Bloodlines. And he definitely has that fur texture that Gast likes to do, but I'm just theorizing here. Point is, the portraits in this game look really clean, they look colorful, and they're very appealing to look at. With some exceptions. For example, I'm pretty sure the Pegasus Rider MarkyJoe is supposed to look like the original MarkyJoe portrait, which looks like shit. But the photo real-life MarkyJoe looks a bit grainy. I also feel that the colors are kind of washed out on that one. There's also like maybe one or two other portraits that look a little off to me, like the meme guy that you see at the very end of the submission. But considering you see him for only like one cutscene and for like less than a minute, I don't really weigh him heavily on the average quality of the portraits in this. So next up is Tale of Pert 2, which I reluctantly rank second place. I say this mainly because when you look at the actual portraits in Tale of Pert 2, they look kind of MS Painty. Like, they don't look clean. There's a distinct lack of techniques such as anti-aliasing that make the portraits look blocky. And some of the portraits look too saturated in color, like for example Boivar's, while others look too muddy, such as Dawn's. I'm not much of an artist, so I'm not well equipped to point out exactly what I think is wrong with the portraits, but those are the ones that I know for certain are an issue. Now that said, they still look like good portraits, and some even look fantastic. Like, the MarkyJoe portrait is straight up amazing. And while I spent a lot of time complaining about the blockiness and the saturation of the portraits, it's really not a big deal. In addition to this, Tale of Pert 2 also gives characters multiple facial expressions, which is something that most submissions don't have. So while I'd still say that The Roots That Bind has slightly better portraits, I'm placing Tale of Pert in second. As for first place, well, this really isn't a surprise. Tactical Nonsense has amazing looking portraits. Alware's art style is so appealing to look at, it's so colorful, there's multiple facial expressions, and Alware just does a really fantastic job showing personality in the portraits. Like, you can tell that Vandal Swiftblade is a cocky little motherfucker just by that shit-eating grin. Evangeline looks curious and absent-minded, and you can clearly see this in her portrait. Vesper looks worldly and playful. Whenever personality is shown through the portrait, I eat that shit right up. And I feel this is why FE1's portraits, while terrible looking, still are so memorable. There's a lot of charm and personality in them. You don't see that in FE2. The characters don't have as much personality, even though the portraits look technically better. Tactical Nonsense manages to have both quality and personality to the portraits, and you can thank Alware, the artist, for that. It's worth noting that Alware was not on the project initially, so it just makes me wonder how the portraits looked before she came along, and how people would have reacted to the submission if Alware never showed up. Next up is the Architect Award. This is for the submissions that have the best looking map design. Most people, at the very bare minimum, had simply okay looking maps. Good, but unspectacular. I can only think of two submissions that had bad looking maps, and that would be Crusaders of the Void and Asylum of Irony. Now that said, because most submissions had such good looking maps, it's hard to really choose which ones truly stood out. I feel the best looking map of the entire contest would be Chapter 1 of Rana's submission, but the other two chapters don't really stand out as much. Though it is worth noting that I really like the flower gardens in Chapter 2. It's a really nice touch. Tale of Pert 2 has consistently good looking maps, but none of them stand out in any particular way, at least to me. Except for the little Elise windows in Chapter 3, which again is a nice touch. I will say that Chapter 1 of Tactical Nonsense also is a very nice and memorable looking map, but Chapter 3 is basically just a fucking door maze. And Chapter 2 is nice, but unspectacular. The only other map that I could think of that is particularly memorable would be Art of Ford's Chapter 3. And that's mainly because of how unconventional it looks. It sticks in your mind because it's just so weird, while also looking nice at the same time. Actually, come to think of it, Art of Ford in general had very nice looking maps, and they do stick in my mind more than the others. Overall though, I'd say Chapter 1 of Rana's submission really is the best looking map in the series, and that alone deserves the award. What I like about it is that, like, it feels like a real location that you can be in. Like, your characters start in the beach area, and it's all sandy and stuff, and the music works well too. And then as you head further west, you are come across by a village, and everything's very well spaced out. There's roads, there's some grass nearby. It feels like a real location, and it's a memorable design because everything's segmented from each other. Like, the top left is where the boss enemies are, top right is just a bunch of sea, bottom right is the beach, and the bottom left is the village. I think that's what makes it so appealing to me. Everything contrasts with each other really well, but at the same time, it all comes together to make a location that I'd actually like to be in. So, if you disagree with my assessment, I don't really blame you, because my justification is basically over one map rather than the sum of the parts. So, take my opinion with a grain of salt. The Audiophile Award is awarded to the submission that has the best soundtrack. I personally determined my pick for this award based on how much I enjoyed the soundtrack on its own terms rather than how well it gels with the rest of the submissions, such as how I determined with the Artist Award. And once again, I give preference to submissions that have custom music rather than ones that use music from the original Fire Emblem games. To me, this is a choice between Sliver's Murder Time and Purge of Ouija. I remember a good amount of songs from both submissions, but I'm going to give extra credit to Purge of Ouija, mainly because all of the custom songs in the game are completely original pieces composed by Tamburino, the creator. In particular, the Chapter 2 player phase theme really stuck with me, and it really conveys this sense of grandness and epicness throughout the chapter. Though I really wish it had a bit more percussion to it, especially as the song picks up in tempo. There's also the title theme of the submission, which reprises when you fight Snarky Foe at the end of the game, which I felt was a really cool touch. I don't think the song is completely original, though. I think it consists of parts from Luigi's Mansion and probably one of the Zelda or Mario CDI games. Now, regarding Sliver's Murder Time, I really enjoy the Chapter 1 player phase theme, which is a cover of the Ultimate Battle from Plants vs. Zombies. The way it sounds when it's translated into Game Boy Advance Fire Emblem sound font just gives it a very different feel from the original song, almost like it's kind of a garage band version. I also really like the Chapter 2 cover of Plastic Beach by Gorillaz. In fact, I actually prefer it over the original because it sounds less weird and just weird. Like, it sounds like an actual song rather than a robot talking into your ears while slowly being shut down. Other notable songs include Beautiful Song from Tale of Pert 2, Chapter 3, Yukari's theme from Chapter 3 of Rana's submission, Chapter 2 player phase theme from Angel of Enragement, both player phase themes from Tactical Nonsense, and of course all the Castlevania music used in The Roots That Bind. Fucking love Castlevania, man. The Writer Award is provided to the submission that has the most compelling story and characters. This is probably the one that I saw the most discussion over. However, as you can see from the voting results, Tactical Nonsense won by an enormous landslide. That being said, there has been some rather interesting criticisms made about Tactical Nonsense's writing. My personal opinions is that Evangeline eating the key was a really fucking stupid justification for having to do the Chapter 3 battle. I can't say that I have any better ideas to make fighting Harry justifiable without that reason, but regardless, it still hurts Evangeline's character significantly in my opinion. I also found it hard to like Peggy because most of her conversations consist of her getting really angry at people, even when they clearly have good intentions, such as Jack. I also don't appreciate her basically praising Evangeline for essentially using Matthew and Vandal for her own gain. Now, I understand why she treats the other characters poorly, because they're acting incompetent and self-serving, but these two scenes don't make Peggy seem any better than they are. Now, that being said, I feel Peggy is easier to fix than Evangeline. All she really needed was a few more cutscenes to show that she isn't always like this, and she has a bit more depth than simply being an angry, bitter person all the time. Alternatively, you could also just not have her being an asshole to Jack and praising Evangeline. All this being said, I should mention that I'm a little biased against overbearing characters, because I just don't get along with overbearing people. I'm also not necessarily a shining beacon of maturity and worldliness myself. So for all I know, she's a perfectly fine character, and it's just my own personal demons that don't allow me to see that. I'm interested to hear what you guys think. Now, this final criticism was brought to my attention by Black Rose. She's a member of the Lair of the Fooker community, and she's done tremendous work on the Lair of the Fooker wiki. Thank you, Black Rose. The criticism she made of Tactical Nonsense that stood out to me the most was the fact that none of the characters learn a lesson from their journey. Now, I don't think there are any hardline rules on how to properly write a story, and I don't necessarily think every story needs to have the characters grow. Sometimes it's better if they stay the same, and in some stories the point is that they don't grow or learn from their mistakes. But I think I would have liked to see more character development throughout the course of the game. That said, it's only 3 chapters long, so I really don't know what you could have done with that. Aside from the complaints I listed, I really enjoy Tactical Nonsense's story, and I do think it deserves the Writer Award. Much of the writing is very compelling and interesting to read. The characters, while they don't grow, are very fun and interesting. And Dat Boy Matthew managed to make one of the most compelling villains in Ragefest, Harry. It's very rare that you see a villain who realizes that they're on the losing side of the battle and has to deal with that fact. There are so many stories in American media that depict the heroes of the story as the underdog, so it's a breath of fresh air to see a villain being the underdog for once. I also feel that Harry injects some moral gray into the story by being a villain that's actually sympathetic and relatable. Unlike the other characters, he actually does go through a character arc in which he has to come to terms with his inevitable defeat and death. That's pretty fucked up, but it's also something that's very profound and human, and his psychology and thoughts are explored throughout the course of Chapter 3. So yeah, I could go on and on about Tactical Nonsense's writing, but I'm gonna stop there and move on to other submissions. Tale of Pert 2 was voted second place. This is something that I really don't agree with. Perhaps this is because Tale of Pert 2 had a lot of CGs and animated cutscenes to make its story seem more compelling, but if you take away that and look at the substance of the writing alone, it's riddled with plot holes and ideas that never reach their full potential. The biggest offender by far is the villain of the story. Athy is one of the most incompetent villains I've ever seen in a Ragefest submission, and her level of stupidity rivals Nurgle from FE7. Picture this for a second. Imagine that you're an omnipotent being, or at least way more powerful than anybody else in your setting. You've established that you can open portals to randomly grab your own henchmen and sentence them to death without any remorse. It's also been established that the only thing that can defeat you is a song sung by a very specific character. What would you do in this scenario? Well, for one, I wouldn't give this one person who could defeat me a chance to do anything and immediately kill her. I wouldn't give this woman an opportunity to have a discussion with the leader of her group about self-confidence. I probably wouldn't have let them get anywhere near my castle. The game makes fun of Athy for being lazy and unattentive, but her actions go beyond laziness, and her level of attentiveness seems to be very conveniently selective, because she pays attention to her own dudes losing and executes them, but never thinks that she could just do the same to the player units. Most of these issues are caused because Athy is so overpowered. If she wasn't seemingly omniscient and able to just do whatever the fuck she wanted, I don't think this would have been an issue. I don't know if this will fix everything about Athy, but it's certainly a good place to start, if nothing else. There's also the issue of Beauvoir's character arc. Her main insecurity throughout the story is that she's worried that her singing isn't good and that it won't be able to stop Athy's magic. This was a valid concern in Chapter 2, but in Chapter 3, where Athy is literally right in front of them and ready to fight, she still hesitates. If Athy were a more competent villain, this moment of hesitation would have meant death. Instead, Athy does nothing while Pert gives Beauvoir a self-esteem speech. And then, despite us never seeing Beauvoir practice, she managed to get her song right on the first try. This character arc would have been way more satisfying if, in the end of Chapter 2, we got to hear Beauvoir sing, realize she sucks, and then Pert tells her to practice so that she gets better, and then she does. Then in Chapter 3, you could still have it so that she has a moment of hesitation, but make it outside of the castle where Athy's not right in front of them. Pert encourages her, and then when they're finally in the castle, she rocks the fuck out and knocks it out of the park. Next up, I just want to give an aside about Dusk and Dawn. As far as I'm concerned, Heirs of Rage is canon to Tale of Pert 2's story. In Heirs of Rage, Dawn and Dusk were willing to do whatever it takes to stop Mari, but in Tale of Pert 2, they're weirdly hesitant on killing Athy, despite Athy being a way more evil motherfucker than Mari. I don't quite understand why these characters had such a 180 from Heirs of Rage, and it's especially jarring when other characters have to tell them that sometimes you gotta kill people. It just doesn't make sense. I can go on and on about the failings of Tale of Pert 2's story, but I also want to focus on the things it did well. For example, if you disregard the out-of-character stuff, Chapter 2 probably has some of the best writing of all of Ragefest. This is where Dawn and Dusk are hit with the realization that sometimes people have to die for the greater good. And the way that they react to this is very understandable, especially since the person they just defeated is their father from an alternate universe, or timeline. I'm still not sure. And to put the cherry on top of all of this, we get to see alternate universe Avraxis get killed by Tiny, and we get to see the face of absolute despair on his wife's face, Olivinion. However you pronounce that. I didn't like Chapter 1 or Chapter 3's storytelling very much, but Chapter 2, I feel, is a sign of Pert's true potential as a writer. I think with a little more experience and criticism under his belt, Pert has the potential to make something that's really substantial and gripping. And hell, even with all the criticisms I said about Chapter 3, I do think that there were some good moments, such as Original being revealed, which was really cool and properly foreshadowed. And then there are bits of the ending scene where we see the characters slowly drifting apart from each other. No words are said, you just slowly see the characters disappear from the picture. If I've seemed very critical of Tale of Pert 2's story, part of the reason was because I felt people were praising the writing more than it actually deserved. But also because I feel like the flaws of the story could have been easily fixed and made the submission one of the best stories of Ragefest. Like, if not for all those things, I genuinely think Tale of Pert 2 would have taken the writing award. If there's ever a Ragefest 6 and Pert enters the contest, God help anybody who's trying to get the writing award, because it's definitely not going to be an easy battle. Lagging far behind Tactical Nonsense and Tale of Pert 2, at least in the voting ballot, is Crusaders of the Void, whose writing flaws are quite obvious. Namely, that the cutscenes are way too fucking long, and the characters spend a lot of time repeating things they've already said. There's other complaints I've heard that I feel are not quite as important, such as Blade Hero becoming the main character of the story by Chapter 2, or at the very least sharing the main character role with Patricius. One person also told me that he felt the story was a bit preachy, though I'm not quite sure why they feel that way. Something that I feel that Crusaders of the Void has over Tactical Nonsense and Tale of Pert 2 is that there's actually a fully realized story arc. Rage Zero is a representation of all of Blade Hero's bad qualities as a person. His self-righteousness, his vengefulness, his sense of entitlement, and of course his sometimes nonsensical decision-making. Not only does Blade Hero admit to his faults, but he doesn't excuse them. He judges himself just as harshly as he judges other people, and I feel that's extremely admirable. After playing Celeste, I think it would have been a better idea if, instead of beating Rage Zero, Blade Hero just tried to come to terms with his darker side. After all, you can never truly get rid of the part of yourself that you hate. It's more a matter of keeping it under control, so that nobody's ever hurt by it. But for what it is, I think Blade Hero did a really good job. Other things I liked about the story is it's just so fucking batshit crazy. You don't know what the heck is gonna happen next. I'm not gonna say that the story makes perfect sense or anything, because I'm sure there are plot holes that I missed, but I never really noticed them because I was so focused on what curveballs the writing would throw at me next. Some of the writing is genuinely funny, some of it is unintentionally funny, but I still count that as a positive quality. So overall, if Blade Hero just gets an editor or learns to show some restraint with his writing, he's gonna make some really interesting shit in the future. And by God, am I excited for that. So the last submission that I feel deserves special mention for its writing is Art of Ford. Similar to Crusaders of the Void, I'm sure that there's parts of the story that just don't make sense. But because the story is so batshit insane and entertaining, you never really notice them. People complain that Lute and Ford are out of character from their FE8 counterparts. I personally don't care. What I care more about is whether I enjoyed them or not. And I felt that their banter was top-notch. Something I really love about the story is how First Lieutenant Gucci used the premise of going into Ford's embellished paintings of historic events in FE8 to justify scenarios that we would never otherwise see in FE8 fanfiction. I also really love the plot twist near the end of the submission, where Nurgle entering the Dragon's Gate leads him into the setting of FE8. Crossovers between FE7 and FE8 have been done before, with hacks such as Sacred Contention, but I really love how Art of Ford handled it. In fact, come to think of it, I don't really have many complaints, if any, about Art of Ford's writing, so maybe this deserves the #1 spot for writer. But it's a bit too late for that since I voted Tactical Nonsense when the voting ballot was open. So overall, if I were to rank these submissions based on the quality of their writing, it would be either Tactical Nonsense or Art of Ford in first place, and then the one that's not in first place would be second place. Crusaders of the Void would be third, and Tale of Pert 2 would be fourth. The Jester Award is given to the submission people consider the funniest, disregarding my commentary over it. It comes to me as no surprise that Purge of Ouija won this award. Purge of Ouija does a really good job at presenting itself as a humorous submission. Tamburino's house is destroyed by a giant floating Luigi head. To stop enemies from spawning, you need the help of Donald Trump, who's able to build walls with magic he learned from Mike Pence. The battle music in Chapter 2 is so incredibly over the top and theatrical that it just makes the scenario seem all the more perplexing. And to top it off, the submission has probably the funniest joke of the entire contest, with Money Man bragging about how he'll never be contained, and then Tamburino just pulls out a gun, shoots him, and the Money Man says, "I have been contained." The sheer amount of genuine laughter I displayed is comparable to the amount of laughter I had when I saw Manfia for the first time in Mark's Special Day. Now that said, I do have some reservations about Purge of Luigi's humor. Namely that whenever the submission tries to get serious, whether it be the Severa recruitment conversation or the conversations with Snarky Foe, they just fall flat on their ass. And overall, I'd say there's not actually a whole lot of jokes in the submission. Last but not least, I also question how people would receive the submission if they don't understand some of the references going on. For example, the Money Man. Though most of the jokes I feel can be appreciated even without the full context. For example, even if you don't know who Donald Trump is, it's probably still funny to think about an old man helping you build walls with magic powers. But let's move on. I'll be going into more detail about the issue of references very soon, I promise you. I think if Tamburino were to make another hack, he should focus almost exclusively on humor. So long as the story makes internal sense, I don't think anybody will take issue with this. Considering Tamburino is already working on another Fire Emblem hack called Fire Emblem Poop, I have a feeling that's exactly what we're gonna get. And I definitely think I want to play that for the channel. Now, for second place, people voted Tale of Pert 2. This is another one that I don't really agree with. And this is where I'm going to really crack down on the whole references thing. I am of the opinion that most humor should have universal appeal. Even if you know nothing about Fire Emblem 8, the banter between Ford and Lute in Art of Ford can be understood and enjoyed by anyone. Tale of Pert 2, on the other hand, I feel relies too much on pop culture references for humor. The most jarring example of this is Dawn's death quote, which not only flew right over my head because I don't get the reference, but it's straight up immersion breaking because it's so out of place with a death quote. I didn't know what it was referencing, but I immediately knew it was a reference based on how out of place it was. And it's especially weird to see Dawn smiling as she's dying. I think a better way to have handled Dawn's death quote would be for her to clearly be upset she's dying, but still have the spirit to make one last pun. That way it's still in character for her, and it's still funny in a sort of morbid way. Of course, at the end of the day, the execution is what counts. Another example of humor in Tale of Pert 2 that didn't sit well with me was Athi's speech patterns. Making it so she adds eth to the end of a lot of her words doesn't come off as humorous or charming to me. It comes off as obnoxious, and it makes it difficult to read her text because the constant eths pull my attention away from what she's actually saying. Now that said, there were some bits of Tale of Pert 2 that I found genuinely funny. For example, I like Pert's catchphrase of, "No one fucks me without taking me to dinner first." And I also really enjoyed how Athi fucks with the objective text in Chapter 3. In fact, despite my dislike of Athi as a villain, I do think she actually has a couple of humorous moments throughout the course of the game. For example, when she tries to cast this super epic time spell that fails to work, and she just gives this fucking facial expression of, "Oh, that didn't work." I also really like how when she's about to be thrown into the portal at the end of the game, she drops all pretense and says "fuck you" right to Pert. Overall, I feel Tale of Pert 2's humor is going to get less and less funny over time as people forget the things that it's referencing. For example, when people stop caring about Fist of the North Star, they're gonna listen to Dusk's critical quote and be like, what the heck is he even saying? I don't get it. Or worse, they'll think it's cringy because it's referencing old, outdated memes that nobody cares about anymore. You see this with memes such as It's Over 9000, Ugandan Knuckles, and the troll face. Nobody thinks these are funny anymore, so I don't see why Tale of Pert 2 would be exempt from this fate. The last thing I want to say is that I don't think all references are bad. If a reference doesn't take away from anything in the submission, I don't think there's any harm in letting it in. For example, the execution scenes are a reference to a show called Danganronpa, and the final blow dealt to Athie I think is a reference to Persona 5. Even without knowing those things, these scenes still make sense within the context of Tale Part 2, so they don't take anything away from it. It's more of just a bonus for people who are familiar with the source material. Asylum of Irony got 3rd place in the voting ballot. I think this is mostly because of my commentary with Mangs, which made the submission seem funnier than it actually is. If you look purely at the script, there's almost no jokes throughout the entire thing. So yeah, I disagree with the placement. Same with Rana's submission. I feel it relies way too much on in-jokes in order to be funny. You basically have to be a diehard MarkyJoe fan to get some of these. Though, even if you don't, I think at least some of them are still funny, such as Ender Slicer being a garbage pail. Crusaders of the Void only got 4 votes, which surprises me because I felt like there were a good amount of funny moments in that submission. The fight against the robot boss, Patricia's being faced with his doppelganger, the battle quote with guns, Blade Hero lying about fucking my waifu, and all the little bits of Patricia's being self-deprecating and snarky. There's also a lot of unintentionally funny shit, such as the awful character palettes. I think the reason why this submission didn't get high in the Jester award is because the writing is so meandering that people didn't pay attention as much. I also think a lot of people quickly wrote it off as a bad submission based on how terrible the presentation was. The Roots That Bind got 5th. Probably because the premise alone was humorous enough. Also, people really liked the cat-faced squall. Like, everyone was like, oh my god, he's adorable! But I'm getting off track here. There were a lot of really funny submissions this year, but I think the funniest one was Tactical Nonsense. I really enjoyed the banter between Vandal Swiftblade and Datboy Matthew during the ends of chapters. And a good amount of the humor is actually quite subtle, such as the conversation between Vesper and Matthew. Matthew criticizes Vesper for everything coming out of her mouth being suggestive. Vesper responds with, and what would you like to come out of Vesper's mouth? There's just a long pause, and Matthew just goes, so yeah, why do you act like that? Completely dodging the question. While I'm not a fan of Peggy, I also feel she was well used in the conversation between Matthew and Vandal Swiftblade, where they try to figure out who is the boss of their mercenary group. The thing that Tactical Nonsense has over other submissions, I feel, is that it's consistently funny and does so without relying on pop culture references or lowbrow humor. I think even if you knew absolutely nothing about Fire Emblem, my channel, or Ragefest, you would still be able to enjoy Tactical Nonsense's humor on its own merit. And that's why I voted for Tactical Nonsense. The Kogasa Award is perhaps the most subjective and difficult to define award of the contest. Basically, I asked people to vote for submissions that subverted their expectations the most. What does this mean? Pretty much exactly what it says. If you had an expectation on how a submission was going to be, and it turned out to be very different from that, then you have a winner. In Ragefest 4, Ragefest Revengeance won the Kogasa Award, and it's easy to see why. The submission set itself up to be a low-quality submission. Then, once Lyn saves you from Evil Lyn, things take a dramatic turn for the different. The music gets really awesome, the fog of war goes away, and there's lots more enemies on the screen. The chapter pretty much opens up from being a linear walk to the throne, and that I think represents the spirit of what the Kogasa Award is. A submission that you expect to be one way, but turns out to be another. If that still sounds too abstract, then I'm sorry. For me, it was no contest. Crusaders of the Void was the submission that took me the most off guard. As unfortunate as this reputation is, Blade Hero is not known for making things that are of particularly high quality, and he's not known for taking criticism very well either. Obviously, the presentation still needs work. He needs to show some restraint with his writing, and he needs to properly balance the difficulty of his level design. But the fact that he was able to make an entertaining story and demonstrate that he is aware of his own faults as a person really took me off guard, and it showed a side of Blade Hero that I didn't even know existed. It is a rare moment for anybody to show humility on the internet. People don't like to admit when they're wrong because they tend to see it as a sign of weakness. And considering failing to admit fault has few consequences, and considering that a lot of people on the internet can be rather nasty, it's no wonder why people don't even bother most of the time. So seeing Blade Hero do this is really impressive to me. I think if he just listens to people more often and takes criticism less personally, he'll be able to make something really awesome in the future. Oh, and just as an aside, Kogasa is the name of a Toho character whose ability is to surprise people. The Memes Award. Ugh. This is for the submission that generated the highest number of new memes. Either I wasn't clear enough or people didn't pay attention, but Tale of Pert 2, despite not generating any new memes as far as I'm concerned, got first place. As far as I'm concerned, here are the memes that were generated by Ragefest 5 submissions. Number 1 is the gun from Purge of Ouija. I'm not surprised this became a meme because it was such a funny joke in the first place. With A New Revelation, we got a meme where people were ironically saying, "I think this is the best submission." With Asylum of Irony, I mean, shit. It's Asylum of Irony. It is in and of itself a meme. Last but not least, we have Vandal Swiftblade from Tactical Nonsense. Out of all these, Vandal Swiftblade is clearly the most popular meme. Whenever I look into my Discord chat and Vandal is brought up, people immediately start talking about how he can't dodge axes and how he sucks as a unit and gets his ass kicked by everything. Even after Tactical Nonsense was finished being played, Vandal continues to generate memes around himself. There's one about how he doesn't finish his fucking errands, and there was one generated from a Dark Souls randomizer stream that he did, in which he kept coming across Gwyn, and one of them was in a T-pose. In my eyes, Vandal is the meme of Ragefest 5. And honestly, I do hope someday he starts making content of his own, because he's actually a pretty good commentator. But yeah, that's my thoughts. I feel like the Memes Award needs to either be removed or changed so that it's much clearer what I'm looking for. The Commentary Award goes to submissions whose footage I recorded had the best commentary. If there's anything I've gained from looking at the results of this, it's that people really like it when I do co-commentaries with other people. And this is the second time that the submission that got first place was a commentary that included Mangs. Now, since this award revolves mostly around my commentary and the commentary of my co-commentators, I want to give an overview of Ragefest 5's commentaries and compare them to Ragefest 4. I feel that overall my commentary during Ragefest 5 was a bit less varied compared to Ragefest 4. There were a lot of commentary gimmicks during Ragefest 4, such as in Moneyfest, where I decided to get drunk, Distortion, where, like the submission, the footage was fucked beyond belief and I had to work with it, Ender Slicer's Escape, and Angel of Darkness, in which both I decided to stream, and the numerous co-commentaries, such as Title Here, where I brought Maritisa, Mark's Precious, in which I brought Gas Station, Lynn's Revenge, where I brought Mangs, and Array of Randomness, where I brought Blade Hero. And who could forget F-Star EXE, in which the submission was so frustrating that I straight up didn't finish it. Ragefest 5 in comparison was more by the numbers, with far less deviation from the standard format of commentary. The only times where I switched things up was with Asylum of Irony, where I brought Mangs, Crusaders of the Void, where I brought Blade Hero, and Rana's submission, where for one part I brought my older brother, who had his own gimmick of bringing Little Hand Bowser, who... well, you all know how that turned out. Some people liked it, other people thought it was super annoying. Perhaps this is because Ragefest 5 is clearer in my memory, but I actually feel I did a better job in Ragefest 5 than Ragefest 4. Some of the gimmicks I had in Ragefest 4 didn't really pan out very well. For example, getting drunk during Moneyfest didn't really seem to make my commentary more compelling. I was just more pissy. Meanwhile, I felt I did a better job editing the Ragefest 5 videos, and I also had more interesting and memorable bits of commentary. Such as when I turn off the god-awful Pokemon music in Sliver's Murder Time, but then proceed to feel lonely shortly afterward, with somber music to accompany me. There's also submissions such as The Roots That Bind, where I felt like I was at the top of my game. I had a positive attitude during most of the submission. I was making interesting observations. I had interesting, funny stories to tell about Fire Emblem. And of course, there came a point where the difficulty ramped up so hard, and I was so close to beating the submission, but not quite there, that I was just totally destroyed, which I thought was very funny to watch. Now that said, I also had a couple blunders in my commentary, such as with Julius's Revenge, whose commentary was so bad that I actually went and re-recorded it because people were so annoyed by all the shit I said about FE4 and Indiana Jones, without properly backing most of my opinions up. And then there was that moment in Tale of Pert 2, Chapter 2, where I defeated the Syraxis wannabe, and all that was left was defeating Foil, who was right in the range of most of my units. And stupidly, I attacked him with Tiny, which, number one, Foil can kill Tiny in a single round of combat, and number two, instead of using the Axe of Despair, which had the Berserker Soul skill, and probably would have killed Foil, I used the Twinkle Stick, which not only missed, but wouldn't have been able to kill Foil anyway, resulting in a game over and several more minutes of me trying to beat the chapter that didn't need to happen. I kept this scene in because I thought it was hilarious, especially since immediately after I made that mistake, I realized, oh shit, Berserker Souls is exclusive to the Axe of Despair. Fuck, I'm an idiot! But clearly my audience didn't think it was funny because I received several comments criticizing me for that move. And yet, despite this, Tale of Pert 2 has 3rd place in the commentary award. What the fuck? I have a couple theories for this, but number one is that it's very possible that the people who criticized me for that move were just a vocal minority. And considering I overreacted to the criticism, it's possible that I perceived that there were more people complaining about it than there actually were. Sorry about that, by the way. It's also possible that Chapter 1 and Chapter 3 made up for the bad commentary of Chapter 2, or it was just that one moment of Chapter 2 that sucked. The last possibility I could think of is that people were unsure what to vote for this award, and they didn't want to watch through all of Ragefest 5 again in order to form an accurate opinion. So they just voted for a submission that they liked. So that kind of sucks, but it would be unreasonable to expect people to look through all the footage in order to decide which submissions had the best bits. Anyway, I went off on a tangent here. What submission do I feel had the best commentary? For me, it was Crusaders of the Void. I know a lot of people really liked the commentary with Mangs on Asylum of Irony, and it was definitely a great commentary, don't get me wrong, especially with Chapter 2 and all the insanity that provided to us. But I feel like I was too passive in that commentary and sort of let Mangs take the driver's seat. I feel like this was inevitable, though, for a few reasons. One is that I'm an introvert, so I spend more time formulating my thoughts rather than speaking them. Mangs, because he's an extrovert, and because he takes commentary much more seriously than I do, is a lot quicker than I am whenever there's something to talk about on the screen. Whenever we start speaking at the same time, I usually let Mangs speak first because I don't like to interrupt people. Now that said, I want to make it clear that I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with this dynamic of commentary. The results speak for themselves. My opinion is mostly a preference thing. So what did I like about the Crusaders of the Void commentary? Well, the main thing is that Blade Hero and I are on equal footing. Anytime there's some insanity on the screen or we come up with some crazy story, we play off of each other. It felt a lot more like we weren't prepared to do commentary, if that makes any sense. Like, we mostly just improvised off of each other and hoped it worked out. And I feel like that made for a very down-to-earth and authentic experience. Like, we were just friends fucking around. Another thing that really sold it for me was that there were a lot of hype moments in Crusaders of the Void. For example, in Part 3, there's this moment where we're not sure that UF is gonna survive the next enemy phase, and all the enemies just fucking unload on her, but she dodges just enough in order to survive, and we just go ballistic. It's really awesome. And then in the finale, the same thing happens. UF survives the enemy phase, and we get all excited, but then she dies of fucking poison, and our reaction is just fucking awesome. There were a couple people who really enjoyed my commentary with Blade Hero in his Ragefest 4 submission. Albeit, it was mostly because the commentary was so cringy. But the surprising thing about Ragefest 5 is that there was a lot less cringe and a lot more genuinely funny moments between me and Blade Hero. So he ended up actually winning over people who didn't like the commentary he did during his Ragefest 4 submission. And some of the people who did enjoy it actually DM'd me and were like, dude, I'm totally sold. You and Blade Hero is a match made in heaven. So there you have it. I really enjoyed a lot of the commentaries I did for Ragefest 5, but those two in particular were definitely standouts. And I'd be happy to have Mangs or Blade Hero in tow for another commentary sometime. The Ring Award is given to the submission that best uses the enragement ring premise of the contest. For those of you who don't know, I included a short story at the beginning of the Ragefest 5 Rules and Guidelines. In it, I explained that F***EXE from Ragefest 4 drove me to complete insanity because of how frustrating it was, to the point where I was put in a mental ward. Raisin, a character from the Toho franchise and in the canon of Ragefest, my waifu, uses her mind manipulation powers and her ability to invent stuff, look it up in Forbidden Scrollery, to create the Enragement Ring, a ring that, once worn, suppresses my anger and my insanity so that I can function like a normal human being again. This story was meant mainly to help inspire people who were struggling for ideas on what to do for Ragefest. But I also wanted to acknowledge and reward the people who not only used the story, but used it effectively. And so, I decided to make an award for it. Tactical Nonsense won this award in a landslide, and for good reason. It was one of the only submissions to use the concept in a meaningful way. Now that said, it's not fully faithful to it. As an example, Raisin doesn't invent the ring, she finds it in a temple guarded by Harry. There's also no mention of the asylum that I was contained in. Not that it really matters. Really, the only other submission that used the concept in a meaningful way was Asylum of Irony. Other submissions either shoehorned it in with a brief mention in a cutscene or as an item, or didn't use the ring at all. Which brings us to Tale of Part 2. Which somehow got second place despite the ring never being mentioned and only being in the inventory of an enemy that you fight once and doesn't even gain any notable bonuses from the ring. What the flying fuck, people? Anyway, let's touch upon Asylum of Irony. This submission was more faithful to the original ring concept than any other submission, including Tactical Nonsense. It takes the asylum part of the story and actually expands upon it. I get thrown in, I meet up with Fathieu, and we orchestrate an escape together. It also uses other elements from the story, such as how when I get angry, my power is immense and uncontrollable. The Warden, or should I say the creator himself, actually takes advantage of this and tries to get me to lose control so that he can use my power for his own nefarious deeds. The ring concept finally comes into play when Raisin arrives with the ring, ready to put it on me so that my power can be contained. For all the faults that the submission had, I really enjoyed that it took on this premise full force. So what is my choice? Tactical Nonsense or Asylum of Irony? Well, in the ballot, I voted for Tactical Nonsense, but now that I've thought about it, I'm not so sure anymore. The ring was a greater focus in Tactical Nonsense, but Asylum of Irony was more faithful to the original story. Since it's called the Ring Award, I think I'm gonna give it to Tactical Nonsense. It used the ring as a major point of the story, so I think that's enough. Looking at the voting results again, I think the reason why Tale of Part 2 got second place was simply because of its popularity. Or maybe because it was adding on to Heirs of Rage, which was already part of the Ragefest canon, whatever the fuck that is. So before I move on to the Viewer's Choice Award, let me just talk about this ring thing more. One of my issues with Ragefest submissions is that they have a lot of in-jokes that most newcomers aren't going to get. The Ring Award kind of makes this problem worse because it's actively encouraging people to add on to a canon that most people don't know about. But Tactical Nonsense shows that you could still make a story that's relevant to the premise without alienating new viewers. And even though it's not necessarily good for the contest in the long term, I kind of like that we've formed this kind of Ragefest canon. So I don't really want to remove the reward in whatever form it becomes in the next Ragefest. What I would prefer to do is find some kind of compromise, something that encourages people to expand upon the existing canon without alienating new people. I haven't thought of any solution yet though, so feel free to tell me what you think in the comments. Finally, we've come to the Viewer's Choice Award. This award goes to whichever submission that you liked best. For me, this was an issue of mind versus heart. Tale of Part 2 versus Tactical Nonsense. Let me explain. In the past, I've stated that I think that gameplay is much more important than story. So logically speaking, Tale of Part 2 would be my pick. It has much better level design and it's much more concise as well. And yet, in spite of this, I find myself much more excited about Tactical Nonsense. I think that's because Tactical Nonsense more closely resembles my ideal Ragefest submission. A fun, lighthearted story with a focus on characters, while at the same time ruthlessly kicking the shit out of me, and giving me enough leeway and options to try new things and play the chapters differently. Tale of Part 2 kicked the living shit out of me and did it in a much more concise and efficient manner, but I didn't really care about the characters or what was going on. And Tale of Part 2 just doesn't give you any reason to go back to it. There's no replay value, there's no way to do things differently in a meaningful way, you can't train the characters differently because they don't level up, and there's no alternate endings or secrets to be found. Simply put, I would be much more excited if more submissions followed Tactical Nonsense's example than Tale of Part 2's. And because of that, I'm going to give Tactical Nonsense my pick. To conclude this series of videos, I'm going to tell you my opinion of each submission, starting from my favorite to my least favorite. As you can see in the video, I've provided a tier list. You might be wondering why I grouped the submissions like this. Let me explain. Top tier consists of submissions that I thought were just absolutely amazing. They have very clear and obvious strengths, and the weaknesses they have are either too few or not severe enough to bring them down to high tier. Middle tier consists of two types of submissions. Ones that have very clear strengths but also very severe weaknesses, or submissions that had no clear strengths but not many weaknesses. Low tier consists of submissions that left very little of an impression on me. They're relatively inoffensive, but also fairly forgettable. And bottom tier consists of submissions that I just really did not have a pleasant time playing. Let's start with Tactical Nonsense. In terms of what I was looking for in Ragefest 5, Tactical Nonsense most fits the criteria. When I think of Ragefest in general, I think of submissions that are very difficult but have some open-endedness to them, and a story that's lighthearted and silly, but I still care about the characters and what's going to happen next. I didn't like Peggy much, and Evangeline eating the key was really fucking stupid, but I enjoyed the other characters quite a lot, and Harry is a very interesting villain. The only thing in Tactical Nonsense that really bugged me was Chapter 2. After you rescue Vesper, there's really not much going on, and if you want to steal the item from the boss, you have to grind up Vandal, which is a fucking slog. But aside from that hiccup and maybe heading the left path for Chapter 3, most of the gameplay is challenging and interesting. I think I would have preferred if it was more open-ended and there was a bit more margin for error and slightly more RNG just to force you to improvise more, but I don't really have many complaints about it overall. Next up is Tale of Part 2. I've stated in the past that I really don't like it when submissions force me to use one specific strategy in order to beat it. And Tale of Part 2 kind of follows this to the T, but I like it. Why? Well, I think the reason why is because Tale of Part 2 is more fair than other submissions that follow the same style of level design. For example, in Moneyman's Last Stand, it's very difficult to tell if and when you did something wrong until it's way too late. And because Moneyman's Last Stand is a single chapter and several turns long, the iteration times between attempts is extreme. Then there's Title Here, which has the same issues but adds RNG into the mix. A perfectly executed run can be ruined by either a miss or a random critical hit done by an enemy wyvern. Tale of Part 2 doesn't have either of these problems because the chapters are so short that iteration times are very forgiving. And so long as you make good decisions, you will never have to deal with any RNG. And whenever you do something wrong, it's usually very immediately apparent, so you know what to do better for the next run. Out of every submission that I found difficult in Ragefest 5, Tale of Part 2 is the only one that I think somebody could realistically beat on their first try from beginning to end. And that is incredibly impressive. Now, with all this said, Tale of Part 2 is still a heavily calculated and rigidly designed submission, and as a result, it suffers from low replay value. There's very little that you can do differently on subsequent runs of the game. And of course, there's the issue of the story, which, as I've detailed in the Writer Award video, makes very little sense. The character arcs don't get fully realized, and the villain is an absolute fucking dingus. While I will say that a story-focused game that has a bad story is a major problem, I can overlook this because everything else about Tale of Part 2 is great. And now we move on to Mark's More Precious, which is a submission made in FEXNA, and consequently, it is not qualified for voting. In terms of gameplay, this is almost an exact reversal of Tale of Pert 2. Whereas Tale of Pert 2 was heavily calculated and had a very specific way to play it, Mark's More Precious is probably one of the most open-ended submissions I've ever played. There is a ton of replay value, not just because you can play the maps differently, but because you have a large cast of characters and you can only select a certain amount of them. And they all play very differently from each other, so each experience is fresh and new. Mark's More Precious achieves this without sacrificing difficulty, because each and every character has been very carefully balanced through rigorous playtesting. I would also like to point out that if Mark's More Precious was not unqualified to be in Ragefest 5, I think I would have given it the Animation Award instead of Tale of Pert 2, because the battle animations in this are fucking beautiful. My only real issues with the submission is that the writing is just kinda there. There are funny moments, but it doesn't really feel like it comes together very gracefully. There's a large number of in-jokes with the Ragefest canon that most newcomers just aren't going to get. I'd also like to point out that Chapter 2 is kind of easy. Most of the enemies just kind of exist to be bait and switched, and that's about it. The only real threats in Chapter 2 are the bosses and the Necro Dragons, which, of course they would be. But again, these complaints are mostly minor. At the top of high tier, we've got The Roots That Bind, which... holy fucking shit, the gameplay in this is fucking awesome. It's almost like Squall dug into my brain to find out exactly what I wanted in terms of gameplay and just dumped it into his submission. It's difficult, it's fair, you're given plenty of options so it's open-ended. There's some RNG, but enough margin for error for it to not be a big deal until the end. And there's constantly new events happening to keep things fresh and interesting. By the time you reach the boss, you're practically clawing your way to victory by your bare hands. It's really intense. And even though it's only a chapter along, it feels like I went through a fucking ordeal after I've beaten it. The only reason why this isn't in the top tier is because the story is just kind of there and the jokes are a bit of a mixed bag. There weren't any jokes that made me, like, really laugh or anything. They gave me a slight chuckle and that was about it. Below it is Calm's Big Heist. I had a really difficult time placing this, Human Armory, Crusaders of the Void, and Purge of Ouija in spots I felt satisfied with. But I feel that out of the four, Calm's Big Heist is the most consistent, and it has the least number of problems. Really, the only issues I have with Calm's Big Heist is that Chapter 3 is a bit of an anticlimax and is really easy. The story makes sense, but it's rather unambitious and lacks any truly memorable moments. I also didn't really see many jokes in the submission at all, which is strange to me considering this is Ephraim 225. Still, he manages to make something that's really fun and innovative. I really enjoy the implementation of the capture mechanic. Creating objectives that encourage you to capture enemies and sell their stuff is a really genius idea, and I hope to see this in future Fire Emblem hacks. Next up is Human Armory, which is very similar to Calm's Big Heist. It expands upon FE8's story, it's rather unambitious writing-wise, and it has a new innovative gameplay mechanic that is the focus of the submission. The main reason why I place it below Calm's Big Heist is because I feel Calm's Big Heist got more mileage out of its gimmick than Human Armory did. This is partially due to the fact that Calm's Big Heist has 3 chapters instead of 1. So it has more room to have a steady and smooth difficulty curve, which Human Armory really didn't. I also feel that Calm's Big Heist is more fair than Human Armory. In Human Armory, if you don't get INAs on turn 3 or 4, you're pretty much fucked from the word go. And while I'm aware that you can safely get out of the situation where Reeve teleports Erica into an unsafe area, I still think it's a bit of a dick move. Though, this is all kind of a moot point because Calm's Big Heist had to be updated just so that Chapter 2 was possible to beat without substantial amounts of luck. So, maybe Human Armory deserves to be higher. But, man, I just like Calm's Big Heist better. Next up is Crusaders of the Void, which has 2 very obvious flaws. Number 1, there's too much dialogue. A lot of the characters tell you stuff that you already know or didn't need to be said. Number 2 is that once you get Blade Hero, you've pretty much won the entire submission. The things that keep Crusaders of the Void in high tier for me is that despite the story being way overwritten, it's very enjoyable and very unpredictable. It's full of really memorable moments, such as Patricius fighting his doppelganger, Patricius against the robot dude, Blade Hero claiming he fucked my waifu. And while the gameplay is really easy after you get Blade Hero, Chapter 1 is really fun and challenging. I also like that you're given a lot of characters to use, which increases the replay value. And if you decide not to use Blade Hero for Chapter 3, I'm pretty sure it would be really fun and interesting. The last of the high tiers is Purge of Ouija. For the most part, the gameplay is consistent and fun. Out of all the submissions, I felt that this one had the second highest resource management and the highest risk management of all. I also found the submission funny in premise, and there are some distinct moments that made me laugh out loud. The reason why it's at the bottom of high tier, however, is mainly because Chapter 2 is a bit bait and switchy. Whenever the story tries to take itself seriously, it's not very compelling. And I do feel that there is a bit of an element of luck in your victory. Topping off middle tier is Art of Ford. It's in middle tier because the writing is really fun and witty, but the gameplay is fucking awful. There's so much luck in it. And sometimes, such as in Chapter 2, the enemy stats are so bloated that just hitting them or killing them or dealing damage is a friggin' chore. Chapter 3 is the only chapter that I found any fun, and that's because the chapter doesn't clusterfuck you with tons of enemies or bloat the enemy stats so much that you're constantly relying on RNG in order to win. I also liked a lot of the enemy placements, such as Sonya being in a very strategic spot that you have to get her out of, but she's guarded by other enemies, so you have to figure out what angle to attack her from. If Snaky 1 and First Lieutenant Gucci make another Fire Emblem hack, I highly encourage them to go the direction they did with Chapter 3. Next up is Rana's submission, whose full name I will not bother to say. This submission is the definition of average. There's no real standout good qualities and no real standout bad qualities. I like that I have a lot of units to choose from, but only a couple of them are any good, while the others are just trash. I think for the most part the level design is good, but Chapter 2 goes on for a bit too long and Chapter 3 feels a bit anticlimactic. The story basically exists to throw in as many references to me and other shit as possible. So unless you're a hardcore MarkyJoe fan, you're probably not going to enjoy any of the jokes or dialogue. I think the only thing that really stood out about this submission was the soundtrack. I felt the musical choices were both memorable and fit the scenarios that they were placed in. It feels like a submission that, while it is never bad, it doesn't quite know what it wants to be either. And as a result, it fails to stand out in any particular way, even if it is better than the submissions below it. Bottoming out the middle tier is Asylum of Irony, which, while it's incredibly creative, it's just not fun to play. That's basically the long and short of it. This is going to seem kind of mean to say, and I don't mean it in a mean way, but looking at Sage Mathis's other hack, Duo Geno Escapo, I get the impression that Sage Mathis just makes Fire Emblem hacks for fun. Like, he just enjoys creating things, and I don't think he cares if it's good or not. I actually think that there is a benefit to this attitude because I feel like one of the reasons why people quit making Fire Emblem hacks is because of the pressure of meeting people's expectations. But his full hack Duo Geno Escapo was not something he intended to release initially, so he didn't have to deal with pressure sucking the fun out of it for him. I'm mostly guessing what his mindset is, so take this with a grain of salt, but assuming I'm right, I think all that Sage Mathis needs to do in order to excel is to just set higher standards for himself. Maybe get a couple playtesters to give him some feedback so he has an idea of what he can do better. I'm aware I just said that pressure can take the fun out of the hobby, but that's why I think a middle ground would be ideal here. Only a couple playtesters, only a little bit of pressure. Anyway, if my psychoanalysis is wrong, then feel free to dismiss everything I just said. Sliver's Murder Time tops the low tier. The soundtrack's nice, but aside from that, there's not much to talk about here. The level design in Chapter 1 is sometimes alright, but Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 aren't very exciting at all. The story's kind of there, and every now and then there's a joke. Not very exciting overall. Same deal with Angel of Enragement, which has worse story and worse gameplay. The gameplay would actually be better than Sliver's Murder Time if not for the fact that the NPC phases are so incredibly long and tedious. Aside from that, the soundtrack's nice, and the presentation is nice. That's about it as far as I'm concerned. Next is Ragefest Chronicles, which... oh boy. Firstly, Chapter 2 feels unfinished. There's barely any opposition to fight, and it's over within like 5 fucking turns. The story also just kind of arbitrarily ends on a sad note. Chapter 1 is a 25-turn long defense mission that only needed to be like 12. It could have been interesting if not for the fact that I was able to break it so easily and just camp in the top left. The portraits are nice, but the characters aren't very likable in my opinion. Really, the best way I can describe this submission is just that it feels unfinished. If I were to guess what went wrong in the creation process, it would probably be that the creator got overly ambitious. He wanted to make an epic 25-turn defense mission, and so he put all of his resources and energy into making it. By the time he was done with Chapter 1, the deadline was closing in. So he had to quickly make Chapter 2 so that he can wrap up the story, and by the time he was done with it, he didn't have enough time to playtest. And so, very tragically, Chapter 1 is easily breakable, nullifying all the effort he put into it. If my guess is right, and that's exactly what happened, holy fuck, I'm sorry, man. Next up is Julius's Revenge. There's really nothing to talk about here. The character descriptions are cute, but the chapter is really easy to break. It's nice that you get so many character options to choose from, but they don't matter when you could just solo most of it with Julius himself. And the story barely even exists. Out of all the submissions in the contest, this one stood out the least. But luckily Darman, the creator, is not terribly attached to it either. He started working on his submission very close to the deadline. So understandably, he didn't expect much. Finally, we've got bottom tier. There is a reason why I placed A New Revelation in its own tier and at the bottom of this tier list. Let me make something clear. The real Ganon, I like you. I think your submission has some good qualities in it. I think some of the jokes are cool. I like some of the creative ideas you put in the gameplay. But holy fucking Christ, man. It is aggressively unfun to play. The chapter starts by putting you in a scenario where it's up to luck whether you survive or not. Then after that, it proceeds to clusterfuck the ever-loving shit out of you with tons of enemy units, with which the only consistent way to deal with them is to camp in the top right for several turns. The submission becomes potentially unwinnable if you have the gall to talk to Kale with Racin and get a promotion item. All because this same conversation triggers several powerful enemies to charge you along with the clusterfuck of other dudes you're dealing with. Then, after that nightmare is over, you have to walk to every single boss to either kill them, to progress the story, or to get an item from them that allows you to kill the other bosses. And once you kill Robin and seize his spot, you're gonna be boned if you can't see the future and realize that there's about to be a bunch of berserkers and falcon knights ready to charge and maul your ass. The submission is designed around tedium. There are a lot of creative ideas in the submission, but the end result is the same. I think this would have done better in previous Ragefests, where the point was to make me angry and frustrated. But in Ragefest 5, where difficulty by tedium, RNG, and cheapness are frowned upon, it just wasn't gonna do well. Now, with all this said, for anybody who made a submission to the contest, regardless of whether it was good or bad, I'm glad that you all came. And I look forward to anything you guys make in the future. This is MarkyJoe 1990, signing out.